made a case for the private sector and in fact questioned the babu culture or the culture of bureaucracy in the country. Now this obviously would have come as a bit of a setback for the civil services, for bureaucrats, for IAS officers. In a way, it is a denouncement by the highest authority in the country. So what did the Prime Minister say? What do we make of it? But more importantly, what have been the reactions to his statement? Sania Dhingra, who tracks the services for us, is with me and will help us understand. So do start sending in your questions for Government Matters. Sania, so, it was 2 days ago, so just to refresh our memories a little bit, very quickly, what did the Prime Minister say?
Yeah, so he was obviously making a case for the private sector, and he was saying that politically it has in the past been seen as advantageous for political parties to sort of rebuke the private sector and, dismiss it as greedy and profit making and so on. But he said now is the time when we need to stop doing that, and the government is very clear that we need to stop doing that. And on the side, he also said that why must the IAS officers be running everything? Why must IAS officers in the country be running businesses, for example? He basically said that, and he used the word babu instead of officers, which is seen as an abuse, as an insult,
like a deriding,
as something, as though you're deriding the officers. In fact, in the piece that I did today for the website, I mentioned that in 2016 the IAS Association had taken very strong exception to the usage of the word babu. And that was against the media. They said that people in the media have started calling us babu, and as a result even ministers are calling us babu, and colloquially the word means a clerk, and obviously it comes from the British, from the colonial era. So they took an exception to this, but now obviously because the Prime Minister has called them babus, nobody is publicly speaking about this, but this is obviously something that they're not happy about, because they say, because the Prime Minister said कि just because IAS आप बन जाते हो, आप chemicals भी कारखाना भी चला रहे हैं, आप हवाई जहाज भी उड़ा रहे हैं, ये किस तरह का पावर स्ट्रक्चर हम क्रिएट कर चुके हैं. So he questioned this sort of hegemony that IAS officers have in terms of decision making, in terms of governance, and he said what is this culture that we have created, and what is this culture that we're trying to create by putting everything in the hands of IAS officers.
Right. In fact, as Sania mentioned, she's done a story on the reactions from the IAS community, so do log on to our website ThePrint.in to read her story. So Sania, if you could just tell us about what some of these IAS officers or former retired or IAS officers have said as a response to the Prime Minister's statements.
There have been parts of their response really. One is just shock that the highest office in the country, the Prime Minister, is speaking in this derisive manner against one of the most formidable pillars of administration in the country. This has not happened before. In my piece, for example, a very senior officer has said that it was in Rajiv Gandhi's time when he had spoken against the foreign secretary, but that was also against an individual officer, but that was also seen as an affront to the whole community, even though it was an IFS officer. But they're saying for the Prime Minister to sort of dismiss the entire IAS fraternity in this manner, that has happened for the first time, so there's shock. But at another level, people are also saying that there is a bit of contradiction in the PM on the one hand dismissing IAS officers and the culture publicly, and his model of governance on the other hand for the last 6 years has been one of sort of giving empowering at least a handful bureaucrats who he trusts, who he sees as meritorious or loyal. And in fact, there have been in several cases, we've seen that even post-retirement officers are given plum postings, and even they continue to be in the government even post-retirement. Several extensions are given. So he has this model of governance where there is a lot of responsibility that is given to a select few officers. Even during COVID, we saw that there was in fact a lot of criticism that while the rest of the world has given a lot of power to experts in in India it is the IAS officers who are running the show. There's this question of contradiction on one hand. And then of course there have been calls for introspection by the community as well. That, you know, some of them say that for a long time it's true that IAS officers thought that we are holier than thou, and they've always dismissed the private sector as greedy. So there have been calls for introspection as well, that we need to engage with the private sector more meaningfully, and well, the message has come from the top, so we have no other option now.
Right. So Sania, because you track the government so closely, you know, you rightly pointed out, or as these officers rightly pointed out, there is this contradiction in Prime Minister Narendra Modi's approach to civil services, perhaps because on the one hand he's empowered, as you mentioned, certain number of bureaucrats.
Yeah.
Sometimes even surpassing ministers, you know, so he has a direct chain with several senior officers instead of having it with the ministers. And on the other hand, he's always talked about, you know, minimum government, or he's the one who's promoted the idea of lateral entry into the into bureaucracy. So how do you view this contradiction? Is there a method to this?
You know, there is also a function of appealing to what the population thinks, what the masses think, and the masses don't view the IAS officers or the bureaucracy very favorably. So what he said about the bureaucracy and about the babu culture, that is actually a very widely held view among people, that they're all corrupt, they're all status quoists,
and that there is so much red tapeism, and
there's so much red tapeism. So he was in fact echoing what the public at large does tend to think about IAS officers. So one can read it as just that, you know, sort of appealing to the masses, but the mass sentiment. But a lot of officers refuse to see this as just that, as an off-the-cuff comment, because in my story, for example, I've mentioned that over the last 6 years, there have been instances where, you know, he has, at least in private, told officers that, you know, आपने मेरे 5 साल खराब कर दिए थे, मैं अगले 5 नहीं खराब करने दूंगा. This is something he said to very senior secretary level officers when he came back for the second term. He's also, you know, constantly talked about corruption among officers, and of course he started this reform of actually getting rid of the deadwood and corrupt officers from the government. His ministers have also sort of taken cue from him, and, you know, the likes of Nitin Gadkari have spoken very openly against IAS officers. So in terms of actually the messaging, this is not that big a surprise, but yes, considering his own sort of dependence on IAS officers, this comes as a bit of a surprise. But you spoke of lateral entry as well. He's in fact said this before, that we need to have experts. Why, even within the civil services, he's constantly said, why must IAS officers be running everything? We need to promote other services as well. We need to promote railway officers, revenue service officers, forest service officers. So he has kind of ushered in this reform, where we are at this stage seeing that, if not completely over, but the IAS hegemony over the last 6 years, even within the government, is sort of at least shaken a bit. So you have officers from across the services, manning several ministries, which may not have anything to do with their service. And of course, with lateral entry, which now the government has expanded, and they're getting 30 directors and joint secretaries into the government. So there is mixed messaging there, but I think what one can sort of analyze from this is that there is this public messaging on the one hand, which is completely against officers. On the other hand, when it actually comes to running the government, there is dependence on IAS officers, and it's something that he doesn't want to do away with also, because this is a tried and tested way of governing. Right.
Perhaps, as you rightly pointed out, it's about questioning the monopoly of the IAS more than anything else. That's perhaps what he's trying to ease out a little bit. Okay, this is a question from Hitesh Nautiyal. Are there any commissions which have been formed especially for reforming the bureaucracy? If yes, then what are these commissions? What are the recommendations?
There are no commissions. Of course, in the past, there's been, the Baswan Committee and so on. There have been a lot of reports on administrative reforms. There are a lot of finance commissions which have recommended administrative reforms. But even though this government has has sort of been better than other governments when it comes to pushing administrative reforms. On ground, not much has happened, because as you know, I did this piece about a few months ago, even about the lateral entry. When it was announced, it was hailed as a massive sort of reform. I mean, 2-3 years down the line, we have seven lateral entrants in the government working as joint secretaries. It doesn't really shake up the system as such.
Right.
But of course, now with 30 more, maybe the scheme is going to expand further. There has at some point there was a thought in the government that we're going to get 400 more directors through lateral entry. Now that will really shake things up. But of course, there have been committees and commissions that have spoken about reforms, but like a lot happens in the government, not much has been done.
Right. Okay. This is a question from Abhishek Singh about whether this is part of maximum governance, minimum government principle of the central government. We've already talked about that. Rakhi Sharma, exams are conducted across a plethora of disciplines via backgrounds of candidates not taken into consideration while allotting ministries. So it's essentially a question of expertise versus what responsibilities you're given.
Yes, in fact, you know, this has been a very commonly held sort of reservation against the system, that we have had officers running the finance ministry who have, you know, running the finance ministry or infrastructure ministries who have done either their PhDs in yoga or they've done their masters in sort of zoology. So they have nothing to do literally with the field that they are in, and these are the most important decision makers in that area. So of course that argument is there, but IAS officers on the other hand argue that they have the experience of having worked on the field. Nothing they say can give you the experience of running and managing a district that IAS officers have. So for them, basically running or heading any ministry is more of a managerial administrative job rather than having the need to actually have expertise in that area. So, you know, for example, Mr. Anil Swarup talks a lot about this. He was a former union secretary. He from HRD to the coal ministry, he's headed several ministries, and he has written even for ThePrint about this, that it never became an issue for me, because as an IAS officer, I don't need the expertise.
So you adapt to whatever you are doing.
Your job is to sort of lead policy making and not to have expertise in that area. So, but obviously it's a hotly contested sort of debate. So, and it's hard to sort of take sides on this. But of course, that debate has been there.
Right.
And just to make one last point, the government, in fact, this government is trying to ensure for the first time perhaps that they give training to officers, and even through Karam Yogi, that's what they intend to do, that officers get training in specific fields, and later subsequently they actually have they're posted in areas related to their training. So the government in some way at least is trying to
in fact we've done a government matters on this Karam Yogi plan the government
so
has.
So in some way the government is trying to promote expertise within the civil services as well.
Right. Okay, so Chetra Saini, how will an overhaul happen? Do you foresee a change in the entire UPSC process as compared to how it has functioned over a period of time?
No, I don't think an overhaul can be expected anytime soon. I mean, at the end of it, civil services it's a system that's deeply entrenched in Indian governance. Even if we were to hypothetically imagine a world where a system where, you know, we have no civil servants and it's domain experts sort of running the government, that will take a lot of time, and that will also require the active help of existing civil servants, because it will be, you know, governance, it can be a gigantic mess as well, and at the end of it, IAS officers understand it. And let's not forget the fact that, you know, there is an element of commitment to constitutionality, etc., that officers bring to the table, which the private sector is not bound to at all. So while we can argue, and several do, that they are status quoists and there is a lot of red tapeism in the government because of career bureaucrats, they bring something to the table which the private sector cannot. There are questions of accountability which will be left unanswered if the private sector is completely sort of completely takes charge. So that's not something that can happen overnight. That's not something that will probably even happen years down the line. So
that's a valid point. It's a question of accountability and what a career bureaucrat brings to the table in terms of sheer adherence to the constitution. Okay, this is from somebody who chooses to remain anonymous. What about politicians? They're also running the show. So I think this is in reference to when we are talking about, how say a certain officer is in the finance ministry who has no background. That's true for ministers as well. Not all ministers are well versed with the ministry they are handling. So without taking names. So I mean that across governments, that's true across governments. So is that also, it's not fair to just point this out for bureaucrats perhaps.
Of course, but I think what politicians and what ministers have is the advantage of
relying on their officers.
Relying on officers, and also the advantage of saying that, well, we were elected. So this whole idea of being elected gives a lot of legitimacy to any minister. And of course, then as you said, when the minister is leading a ministry, then they are supposed to rely heavily on their officers, and it is the officers more than the IAS officers who also get transferred very frequently. It's the other officers who stay in one ministry for several years. These are they come from the Central Secretariat Service. So these are officers who sort of constitute the institutional memory of the government, and ministers are supposed to depend heavily on them. So of course, this question that ministers also need to have domain expertise. Well, I guess the government's answer to them would be our foreign minister, but not everybody can be like that. But but that's also a distinction between what is expected from ministers and what is expected from their staff, which is officers.
Right. Okay. Tapan, shouldn't the IAS community be grateful that a huge burden of running things away from expertise might be reduced? Won't it help them to focus on the primary duty to serve people directly at grassroots? So in a way, should they not be happy that the Prime Minister feels the private sector should have more stake? It reduces the pressure, the burden on bureaucrats.
I think if anyone, since most of us have interacted with IAS officers, we know that they're not happy about letting go of any power at all. So I don't think they will be particularly pleased about this. But yes, as I mentioned, there are some officers who see this as as a timely reminder that this is not the era where the private sector can be neglected. The private sector, even in different ministries, you see at a very micro level, every ministry is interacting with the private sector in their area. So I think the message is very clear to the officers, whether they like it or not, the bureaucracy has to engage with the private sector, even if they're not very happy with it, but it has to be done.
Right. Rupinder Singh, does the Modi government share a bitter relationship with its IAS officers? Do you think this government demands greater compliance from IAS officers than previous governments? So I think the first part we've talked about earlier, that it's a mixed message, but the second part, is this government more strict, for the lack of a better word, with IAS officers?
I think it's a little complicated because the officers who the government trusts, they are known to have a relatively free hand when it comes to sort of running schemes in their ministries and getting things done. So while it is at this point, and I think 6 years down the line, it is known that the PMO is sort of running the show largely, but there are certain bureaucrats who are identified as performers, who are given a free hand when it comes to governance. But by and large, yes, one can argue that those who do not fit into this scheme of things do find themselves relatively disempowered, do find themselves under great scrutiny as well. So again, it's a complex sort of an arrangement with this government and its bureaucrats.
Right, but I suppose that would be true for any government, right, Sania, in terms of, just to sort of speak from the other side, in terms of there being one control center. For instance, if right now it's the PMO, under the UP it was perhaps 10 Janpat. So it's always a complex relationship between the government and how the government is run.
And of course, with a coalition government, it becomes a little more, the decision making becomes a little more decentralized. And with the majority government, you see the opposite happening, which is what has happened in the last 6 years.
Right. Okay. This is from Rohit. Are politicians not responsible for promoting the babu culture, as mass transfers take place in most cases just after a new government takes charge? So this is a fair point. It's all right for the Prime Minister to sort of question this babu culture, but at the end of the day, politicians have also exploited this culture to the hilt.
Yes, of course, and even in this government we have seen very, very frequent transfers of officers, right from the secretary level to your joint secretary, director level. Right. We have written on several occasions about this, that even your top officers don't get to spend more than 10 to 12 months in a ministry. So how are they supposed to, actually lead and sort of change things and shake things up when they're transferred at the drop of a hat? And as of course, with the mixed messaging, there are so many examples one can give. Lateral entry into the government is one thing, but then you have commissions and tribunals, etc., where the government is not bound by law to only appoint IAS officers or retired IAS officers. You can appoint experts on those positions, at least, if not the government. But what's been stopping the government from doing that? We've had a series and several cases where officers have just retired, and 2 months down the line they've been appointed as the head of some commission or some tribunal. So of course there is a double speak there. Why, if you need experts, why not get experts there? So these questions remain, but I think those questions and those contradictions don't take away from the political significance or the administrative significance of the statement that the PM has made nevertheless.
Right, okay, we're running out of time, but I'll take two last questions and I'll club them because they are similar. One is from Kamal Shah. There's a debate that lateral entry will hurt people from reserved categories and essentially work in the favor of people with privilege. What are your comments on that? And there is another question from Payo Jism. Isn't it possible that Modi is building the base for a future where lateral entries become the norm rather than exception? So both questions to do with lateral entry.
I think the last question I've answered, because even if lateral entry, there's lateral entry in bulk into the government, I don't see IAS officers or civil servants going away or disappearing from the scene.
The civil services.
They probably can't, at least in the foreseeable future they cannot. As far as reservation is concerned, yes, that's been a very pressing issue and very pressing concern as with regard to lateral entry, that the government is not liable or not bound to reserve the seats for SCs, STs or OBCs,
right.
Or even disabled candidates or so on when it comes to lateral entry. And the government has, in fact, even on the floor of the parliament, said that yes, we are not going to do it, and we are not going to have reservation in lateral entry. And this, they have used a clause in administrative rules of the DOPT to say that when a position is being given on a contractual basis to an individual, then the government cannot sort of apply the reservation and the quota on that position,
right.
because this is being given to one position, one person. How do you apply quota for one position? But of course now we have increasingly we have voices from the civil society as well questioning that if lateral entry has to happen in bulk, then the government can't circumvent reservation through this technicality. But it's something that the government will have to at some point answer. But as of now, it has made its stand
right.
very clear that it is not, reservation is not applicable to lateral entry.
Right, okay. So Prime Minister Modi's statement perhaps in a way opening a Pandora's box, but Sania explaining the significance of that statement and also very importantly explaining what the IAS community has to say and what this means in terms of the government's relationship with the bureaucracy. Thank you so much for watching Government Matters, for sending in so many questions. Keep subscribing to our YouTube channel and have a good weekend.